Hello there everyone, I'm your host, the Sea Monster, and I welcome you all to my essay video on Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. Don't worry, I'm not going to say that name like that through the rest of this video, so yeah, just don't worry about it. Released in 1995, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah is the seventh and concluding entry in the Heisei era of Godzilla films. It was written by Katsuki Omori, who previously wrote various other entries in the Heisei era, and was directed by Takao Okawara, who had previously done Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and would later go on to direct Godzilla 2000. If you have been following me as of late, you may know that I don't necessarily rank the Big G's Heisei era quite as highly as a good number of my peers have in the past. Perhaps it's because I don't have the nostalgia for it like I do for other installments in the Godzilla franchise, both pre- and post-Heisei. But whatever the case may be, I generally consider the Heisei era of Godzilla to be a series of peaks and valleys. Now, when it comes to Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, while it certainly has its share of issues, it does hold up better than most of its predecessors in the Heisei era. In fact, I really like Godzilla vs. Destoroyah and find it to be a satisfying conclusion to the Heisei films overall. But since we also talk about how well a film holds up from an objective standpoint, it's still pretty far from perfect. And so, the time is now to find out why that's the case. So, let's get into this thing, shall we? I suppose it makes sense to go over a short summary of the film's premise/plot, just so we know what the story is for the sake of context, before we go into more of the details. The basic premise in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah deals with the world facing an impending calamity of epic proportions, when Godzilla has entered in a sort of burning state, where he is on the verge of melting down, which could destroy the planet if he's not stopped. The emergence of Godzilla's burning state was the result of Boss Island being destroyed, where he and his son Junior resided on, with the fate of Junior being left uncertain. Eventually, though, Junior reemerges with the potential of becoming his father's successor. And if the threat of nuclear destruction by Godzilla's unfortunate condition wasn't bad enough, things only get worse when a new species of deadly organisms, referred to as Destoroyah, emerges and mutates from the effects of the Oxygen Destroyer, the very weapon that was used to kill the original Godzilla back in 1954. And so Miki and company, which also consists of the descendants of Dr. Yamane from Gojira 54, all find themselves in one heck of a thermonuclear pickle as the fate of the world hangs in the balance, leaving humanity in a place where it needs to contend with putting down both Godzilla and Destoroyah before the world is destroyed by one or the other. Now, the plot as it stands isn't amazing, but I can at least say that it holds together well for the most part and is thematically rich. The film makes its stakes incredibly clear and congruent as they involve humanity being caught between a rock and a hard place, having to deal with the danger of global nuclear annihilation by Godzilla, who is on the verge of melting down due to his exposure to a uranium deposit, which resulted from Boss Island being destroyed by volcanic activity, while simultaneously dealing with Destoroyah infesting Tokyo and evolving into a personification of the Oxygen Destroyer itself. Humanity, as represented by the UNGCC and its affiliates, has to contend with the sins of both its usage of atomic weapons and the sins of the Oxygen Destroyer's usage. So, despite still standing by the end of the story, a hard lesson is passed on to it so that such potential horrors could never be repeated, with an uncertain future waiting over the horizon. Calling back to the roots of the original's themes regarding atomic power, the horrors of nuclear Armageddon are imminent as Godzilla is on his way to uncontrollably melting down, reducing all life on Earth to atoms. The discovery of atomic power, the weaponization and exploitation of such power has all come to a head with the threat of Godzilla, a product of such exploitation, burning the world down as he dies from the same power that essentially made him as mankind knows him up to this point. Not only that, but the addition of Destoroyah, born from the use of a weapon arguably much more potent than the atom bomb in terms of destructive capability, as well as the suggestion of that same weapon being recreated and used again ties back to the unintended consequences of the use of such devastating weaponry, similarly to how the bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki resulted in even more deaths during their aftermath, as well as the threat of such devastation being repeated that the world has seen happen in the years after World War II, most notably during the Cold War. Thus, eventually, both Godzilla and Destoroyah, who were each a consequence of the use of weapons of mass destruction, clash with one another. The living embodiments of two legacies of destruction coming to a head in an epic battle to determine which one will be left standing. And whereas the Oxygen Destroyer brought about the end of the original Godzilla from 1954, Heisei Goji in this film assists mankind in facilitating the end of Destoroyah right before he himself succumbs to his condition, which mankind goes on to contain. The thematics in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah not only tie back to Gojira 54 in a very strong way, but also give the Heisei timeline some pretty solid closure, even with the overall mixed quality of the series in mind. Not to mention, the film is also able to have some pretty sound reasoning for why previous methods of trying to stop Godzilla from past films won't work this time, even if through inference. One example would be that ANAB, anti-nuclear energy bacteria used in Godzilla vs. Biollante, wouldn't work due to the Big G's immense and ever-increasing heat levels, reaching at a point where such bacteria would be overwhelmed should an attempt be made to inject it into his body. Another example would be how machinery like Mechagodzilla and Mogira were both destroyed to the point of being unsalvageable, thus drying up the UNGCC's access to futuristic technology, which was salvaged from Mecha King Ghidorah's remains prior to the events of Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. With this in mind, the UNGCC now has to rely on present-day tech from the JSDF, which consists of, but not limited to, Maser tanks and the newly constructed Super X-3. And as far as the prospect of bringing back the Oxygen Destroyer is concerned, the device had such a negative effect on the ocean waters since 1954 that the idea of weaponizing micro-oxygen to replicate the OD to reduce the fallout of Godzilla's burning state would be a very controversial move. Thus, despite the dire situation, the recreation of said device is rightfully called out on by Miki and Emiko. And this is all before everyone is even aware of Destoroyah suddenly emerging. Now, there are some questionable components in the plot, though, even for as much as I'd be willing to defend it overall. One such example would be the fact that the Super X-3, despite being a very cool and slick inclusion in the film to tie it back to the humble beginnings of the Heisei series, is only introduced now when such hardware would have been pretty useful during certain prior events had Japan opted to commit full time to perfecting the Super X concept to where this thing would be available and ready to combat against things like Batra or Space Godzilla. Or, even if the events of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah or Godzilla and Mothra: The Battle for Earth were too early, then the JSDF would have had this thing ready to either coincide with Mechagodzilla or even replace Mogira altogether during the events of Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. While one can infer that it took the JSDF this long to perfect the freezing tech for the Super X-3, the jet could still be deployed without said freezing tech in order to counter certain threats sooner while the tech was still being worked on and finalized. Maybe they could even mass-produce the Super X-3 to where they'd have a whole squadron of them at their disposal. Smaller, but still made with the same material that's resistant to Godzilla's atomic breath as was shown. Considering that it was able to be resistant to Godzilla's atomic breath while he's in his burning state, it certainly would have been effective when he was not in his burning state. And this is especially considering that the JSDF were able to develop such powerful material that's shown to be even more potent and effective than what the Super X-2 had back in Godzilla vs. Biollante, and they can replicate it for a version of the Super X that's arguably much more streamlined. There's also the weird fact that it took about 7 years for the Super X-3 to be built, while Mechagodzilla only took 2. Even with the leftover future and technology in mind, you'd think that the complexities of building and perfecting a Godzilla-sized robot would take way longer than building what is essentially a big fighter jet. But no, apparently it's vice versa in this universe. Okay. Perhaps we could have been provided some justification for why the Super X3 wasn't readily available prior to its current events, or even better, if we had a previous film provide that justification or explain that the ship is still a work in progress that's concurrent with the likes of Mechagodzilla and Mogira, in case a future film were to pay it off down the line. And that would have helped in strengthening the continuity in the Heisei series, which is something that it has been lauded by Godzilla fans for having, despite certain other entries proving the contrary. Another aspect of the plot that's a bit iffy, one may say, is the notion that the characters in the film, particularly the UNGCC and those affiliated with them, would assume that Junior is dead as a result of Boss Island's destruction. Now, sure, one could say, since Junior is younger and not as powerful as his father, that he may not be able to survive a volcano or volcano-related activity, which was something that his father was able to survive not once, but twice in the series. But considering that Junior was able to shoot what appeared to be atomic embers from his mouth back in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, it does beg the question, how much of a mutation via nuclear exposure would a Godzillasaurus have to undergo in order for it to survive being engulfed by a volcano, let alone swim in a volcano? Not to mention, the volcanic activity which destroyed the island also left a uranium deposit, which is how Godzilla started to go into his burning mode. So Junior potentially getting exposed to that same deposit would be something that the folks at G-Force would humor the possibility of and not jump to any conclusions that state otherwise. Again, Godzilla fell into a volcano back in the Return of Godzilla, only to come back 5 years later in Versus Biollante. And he was actually shown to be even more powerful than he was back in Return of Godzilla as a result of him being in that volcano for half a decade. And there's also the fact that he fell into an underwater volcano during his fight with Batra in Godzilla vs. Mothra. And the UNGCC were pretty well aware of him surviving a fall into a volcano, at least in the latter example, assuming that the first example didn't happen thanks to a certain film which involved time travel. So, taking all this info into account, while Junior being arguably less mutated than his father prior to the events of Godzilla vs. Destoroyah would lend some credence to the UNGCC expressing doubt that the little guy could survive an eruption, the fact that the uranium deposit was there and further imbued Godzilla with excess amounts of nuclear energy would have given more people than just Miki a good enough reason to seriously consider Junior's survival and mutation by said deposit. And with this in mind, the drama revolving around whether or not Junior survived is somewhat undermined, and the grand reveal of the little guy being alive and well is less of a surprise and more of a foregone conclusion. Now, there's one last element that has seen some contention in terms of the film's storytelling, and of course this means we have to look back at good old Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah in order to discuss this particular aspect. So, there's the question of how the Oxygen Destroyer, and by extension the events of Gojira 54, could still have happened despite the time-traveling shenanigans back in Versus King Ghidorah, considering that the Godzillasaurus on Lagos Island was moved to a spot in the Bering Sea by the Futurians during World War II. And this means the Godzillasaurus would become Godzilla in the Bering Sea as opposed to Lagos. Now, I want to make this clear, the plot of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah is an absolute mess that has done significant damage to the Heisei series, filled with time travel mechanics, world-building implications, and character motivations that implode in on themselves upon even a minimal amount of scrutiny.
I'm not used to this level of scrutiny!
But, just going off of what we are given at this point in the series, since Gojira 54 never established that the Godzilla in that film came from an island called Lagos, and considering that he also dies by the end thanks to the Oxygen Destroyer reducing him to bones, it's very apparent that Heisei Goji is the second Godzilla in the timeline, and there is room to suggest that he was the Godzillasaurus at Lagos. All of this is to say that the events of Gojira 54 where Godzilla rampaged through Tokyo and Serizawa used the oxygen destroyer in order to kill the Big G as well as himself, still happened in the Heisei timeline because they weren't affected by the time travel BS. Granted, this doesn't explain everything else that vs. King Ghidorah does to F over the Heisei timeline, but I recommend checking out my video on that film for more information, just so we can try to streamline this whole video on Godzilla vs. Destoroyah so that we can get back on to talk about that film. Now, there's also the fact that Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah established that Godzilla went on to devastate Japan in the future, and as a result, this raises the question on whether or not Junior, who becomes a new Godzilla at the end of Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, is that same Godzilla, considering he's had a relationship with humanity that's less negative to where he even imprinted on a human as his mother in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, and was acting more playfully with some humans like Yuri back in vs. Space Godzilla. So, one can't help but ask, based on this info, does that mean the Futurians were just full of crap the whole time and everything they did back in vs. King Ghidorah was pointless? Granted, it was already kind of pointless, but what I mean is it's now even more pointless. Like, it went from having no point to an ultra-negative point. Or did moving the Godzillasaurus from Lagos Island to the Bering Sea somehow result in a separate member of the species going on to become Junior in the timeline as we know him up to this point? If the former is the case, then that's just hilarious. But if it's the latter, then that's just another tally for the sheer nonsensical aftershock from the events of Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah. Because how would moving one Godzillasaurus from one spot of the world to another in the past affect the future of another Godzillasaurus? In the words of Harry Plinkett, I'm so confused. So yeah, the plot does have its share of snags which certainly could use some fixing. But, and this is a big but, it still manages to hold together better than not, and the story is able to be thematically congruent while still remaining as fairly sound despite the snags. Now, as far as the human cast is concerned, the characters generally fall within the range of pretty decent and functional at the very least. In terms of writing, they aren't necessarily great, but still nowhere near the level of what I would describe as outright bad. There are a few worth highlighting here, with the first being Heisei regular, Miki Sagusa. Miki spends the majority of the film trying to figure out where Junior is at in the wake of Boss Island's sudden devastation, while also speaking out against the replication of the oxygen destroyer as a means to euthanize Godzilla, given the infamous results it left behind due to its strongly negative effects in the ocean, and this is all excluding the emergence of Destroyer, like I said, as a reason for Miki to not approve of its usage. She also finds her psychic powers beginning to dwindle, which means she's having difficulty in search for Junior, and this adds to her concern about his current well-being, assuming that he's still alive out there. So she finds herself needing to follow some leads which could indicate his survival, like the report of dead whales in the ocean. Miki has to grapple with the inevitability of Godzilla's death, despite her sympathy towards him and his current state, and what it could mean should the UNGCC fail to contain it properly. However, even that is outweighed by her concern for Junior's well-being, such as when she initially objects to the idea of using him to lure Godzilla to mainland Japan instead of letting the two kaiju meet at the Bering Sea in order to reduce his meltdown, only to be talked into not letting her sentimentality get in the way of what needs to be done. This grappling with such impending finality adds to the film's emotional heft, with Miki being a primary witness to its most tragic events, like Junior's apparent death and Godzilla's definitive end. I appreciate how this film gives Miki more to do that actually justifies her place in the story in a congruent way, as opposed to having her be nothing more than set dressing in certain prior entries, or resulting her side of things be so sloppily executed and slapdashed, like in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla. And given that she's been a part of the Heisei series since vs. Biollante, the film gives Miki a poignant send-off just as she does the same for Godzilla himself. Then we have the descendants of Dr. Yamane himself, Kenichi and Yukari. First, let's go over the former. Kenichi is brought in by the UNGCC for his insight on Godzilla. He was overlooked initially due to his theory that Godzilla's heart being akin to a nuclear reactor got him laughed out by his peers. Now, I get that just because crazier things like time travel and weird hybrid monsters have occurred in this series, that doesn't mean Godzilla's heart being akin to a nuclear reactor could also be likely. However, considering the Big G's nuclear origins, and given the energy that he exudes is in fact nuclear, Kenichi being ridiculed for his heart reactor theory is a bit odd, given that Godzilla being a monster of atomic origin should be public knowledge at this point. Not that this is a huge issue in the film, but I figured it's worth noting here. Anyways, moving right along, there is a neat little detail in his introductory scene where Kenichi is in his room trying to keep himself cooled down, even trying to get his fan going, due to the day being rather warm. Perhaps one may even say, hot. Maybe even give him a burning sensation. You get what I mean. This could reflect the current situation regarding Godzilla, where Kenichi is about to be called upon to help the UNGCC and figure out how to stop the Big G from overheating. He agrees to come in and goes on to be an advisor on the ever-changing situation regarding Godzilla's burning state, as well as on how to stop him, which includes, but isn't limited to, bringing back the Oxygen Destroyer. This is a neat little contrast from Dr. Yamane in 54 wanting the original Godzilla to be spared for scientific purposes, though in Kenichi's case, time is way more of the essence, and the stakes are way higher than in 54, since the whole world is about to be destroyed in a flash if attempts aren't made to quell Godzilla's burning state. As the plot progresses, Kenichi goes on to deduce how Godzilla would go from simply exploding like the world's biggest atom bomb, thanks to the efforts of the Super X-3 essentially cooling him down, to melting down after said sequence. Whichever one is the case, the planet and everything on it will be destroyed unless the output of Godzilla's destructive energy is reduced significantly. From then on, Kenichi, much like pretty much every human character in this film, stands and watches as the events in the film culminate towards Godzilla's death, similarly to how his ancestor, Dr. Yamane, did the same back in 1954. Now onto Yukari, a news reporter who finds herself thrusted into the situation regarding Destoroyah. It's an interesting dynamic to see the two descendants of Dr. Yamane each having to be involved in the legacy of the events of Godzilla 54. Kenichi is involved in helping G-Force understand Godzilla's dire condition and how they should go about mitigating it, even pragmatically suggesting the recreation of the Oxygen Destroyer in order to kill him, contrasting with how Dr. Yamane lamented over the death of the original Godzilla due to the lost potential of how such a creature could benefit mankind in the long run, despite the creature's death being essential for further death and destruction to be averted. Meanwhile, Yukari is primarily with Professor Fukuzawa, who has been working on micro-oxygen, which in turn leads her into witnessing the growing threat of Destoroyah, an unforeseen result of the Oxygen Destroyer's use back in 1954, and the personification of Dr. Serizawa's worst fears of his own invention coming to light. Much like her brother, Yukari is also a witness of Godzilla's death, and she's the one who provides the monologue about how mankind still paid for all of it. The Big G's creation and everything that came afterwards. We also have Emiko Yamane returning from Godzilla 54 and even reprised by Momoko Kochi, having a minor role yet still managing to add to the film's thematic potency. She provides a word of warning about the use of micro-oxygen, which bears similar properties to the Oxygen Destroyer, a device with terrible power which she witnessed firsthand that Dr. Serizawa went out of his way to ensure that no one would be able to replicate. She also serves as another connection for this film to the original Godzilla from a thematic standpoint, and one that is meaningful and tastefully done. Due to her relationship with Serizawa, who let himself die so that the Oxygen Destroyer couldn't be replicated, and due to her being a witness of the device's devastating capabilities firsthand, Emiko tries to remind certain characters of the horrors that the newly revealed micro-oxygen could bring that hauntingly reminds her of the Oxygen Destroyer itself. Again, her role is pretty minimal, but it's nice to see her character return as a callback to the original film that actually benefits the story of this film, as opposed to damaging it, which is more than I can say for other films that try to do something similar, only for it to be at those films' detriment. Next up, we bring our attention to Professor Fukuzawa, the scientist who spearheads the project that replicates the power of the Oxygen Destroyer, but with the intent to benefit mankind in an attempt to solve world hunger. His part in the story plays into how, no matter what can be done to prevent further calamity, mankind still has the potential of allowing such calamity to happen, even if by accident, without considering the lessons imparted by history. Fukuzawa's micro-oxygen experiments is stated to have the potential of being another version of Serizawa's oxygen destroyer, and so his research on the properties of micro-oxygen lead into the revelation of the Destoroyah beginning to emerge. For the rest of the film, he tags along with Yukari, and he also advises on how the Destoroyah can be more efficiently killed, which is how freezing weaponry becomes the means which spell Destoroyah's end. Fukuzawa's intentions are more philanthropic, despite the involvement of something as potentially deadly as micro-oxygen. He's a rather decent man whose ambitions cloud his judgment, only for him to get some much-needed clarity as the story progresses, once he sees the unintended results of his endeavors with micro-oxygen. We also have Miro Ozawa, a psychic like Miki who trained in the United States to join G-Force's psychic division. She's mainly here just to tag along with Miki, whose psychic abilities have begun to fade over time, which has made it difficult for her to track Godzilla or to find Junior. Ultimately, Meru is just kinda there, but I do want to address an aspect of her character that's a bit off, let's just say. And this is going to require me to go into a slight tangent, but let me cook here, okay? So during the scene where Miki explains about her psychic powers fading away, which is the result of her growing out of them, Muro, despite being a part of a pretty important division in G-Force, states that she cannot wait to grow out of her psychic powers. This is pretty strange and honestly makes Muro come off as irresponsible in a way, because despite the Heisei series not really utilizing the psychic angle with Miki in the best of ways, these psychic abilities fading away should be very much concerning for Muro and by extension the UNGCC, because they are what would help that group in tracking Junior's movements in case he were to still be alive and become the next Godzilla. Or, heck, the movements of any giant monster that could arise in the future. Miki has an understanding of what it means to lose these powers over time, so why wouldn't Meru? Does Meru even care that her psychic abilities could be useful in saving lives? That they could serve as a means to potentially delay or even stop a kaiju attack? If these psychic powers were considered to be such a burden, and if using them were to have consequences like the strain of using them could do serious harm, physically or psychologically, to anyone who has them, then that'd be one thing, and it'd be understandable for why Meru would like to not have them. However, apart from the one time where Miki tried to use her powers in Godzilla back in Godzilla vs. Biollante, where she was still young and hasn't fully trained or developed with her powers to where the strain of using them caused her to go unconscious, there isn't any indication of Miki or Meru using their powers having a negative impact on them. If there was something like the risk of brain damage that would come as a result of using these psychic powers for, let's say, getting Junior to go to Tokyo so that his father could follow him to there, then we would have not just stakes for Miki's well-being over the course of the series, but we'd also have some level of reasoning for why these psychic powers aren't used all that frequently to will something like a kaiju into moving away from one place and to another in some of the previous films. Heck, if we were to workshop some of the Heisei films prior to this and have it to where Miki was eventually slowly dying because she was trying to use her psychic powers a little more frequently throughout the series, then Meru, seeing the toll that such use of these powers has taken on the Miki, could actually inform why she has the perspective that she does here. But alas, all of that isn't the case, and we're now just left wondering why Meru would look forward to losing her powers when they are shown not only to have no lasting negative effects on her, but they've also proven to be helpful when it comes to averting certain crises or even aiding G-Force in averting said crises. I suppose one could argue through inference that Meru learned this by the end and came to the conclusion that her eventually losing these powers like Miki may not be a good thing after all, but there's so little, if anything, in the film to back that inference up, and at this point, we'll never really know if that's truly the case because this is the final film in the Heisei series, meaning that we'll never get a definitive answer down the line. That is, unless you want to count the Gemstone shorts, Godzilla vs. Gigan Rex and Godzilla vs. Megalon 2023, which imply to take place after the events of Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, with Junior being the Godzilla in question. However, neither of these shorts really elaborate on what happened with Miki or Mero or anybody else in this film after its events, so yeah, there isn't really much we can really go off from here at this point, so yeah. In closing, however, the human characters in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, while not the most praiseworthy element in the film, are still functional and do serve the story well enough, warts and all. Now, onto the Kaiju side of things in terms of characterization. For starters, let's talk a bit about Junior and his journey over the course of the 3 entries in the Heisei series that he was featured in. Junior has undergone a pretty fascinating journey since his first appearance in Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2. Having been discovered by researchers and brought to mainland Japan for study, Junior, referred to Baby Godzilla in this film, found himself being looked after with compassion by Azusa Gojo, whom he imprinted upon hatching from his egg. This connection with Gojo, despite him still being used by the UNGCC to exploit a potential weakness on Godzilla, namely the second brain, would allow Baby to have a less hostile attitude towards mankind. Of course, he had to be eased into bidding farewell to his surrogate mother and to be taken in by Godzilla as an adoptive son, thanks to Miki's psychic powers. But by doing this, Baby motivates Godzilla to let mankind be, now that he's found another member of his kind, a younger member that he can look after, something which could even motivate him into moving on from his vendetta with mankind. And for a time, as we see in Godzilla vs. Space Godzilla, that was more or less what happens. Godzilla stops attacking Japan due to his newfound responsibility as a father for Junior, referred to as Little Godzilla this time around, and he only returns to mainland Japan when Space Godzilla threatens the child's life. Godzilla then returns to Boss Island after destroying Space Godzilla with the knowledge that his son is safe again. And so, now we come to Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, where Junior is initially thought to be dead as a result of volcanic activity which brought Boss Island down into the depths. Later on, he reemerges, looking much closer to resembling his father than ever before, and is migrating to the Bering Sea in the hope of meeting Godzilla there before he dies. But as a result of Miki and Mero using their abilities by order of the UNGCC, Junior is guided into mainland Japan so that him and Godzilla could be placed in a single spot for the JSDF and the Super X-3 to begin cooling the Big G down with every bit of freezing weaponry that they could muster. This results in Junior encountering Destoroyah and having an intense battle with him. Despite being overwhelmed for a good chunk of the fight and even having some of his juicy energy sapped out of him at one point, Junior is able to beat Destoroyah back, demonstrating the same tenacity and some of the power that his father has. Once the fight is over, he goes on the rendezvous with Godzilla. Junior has a nice moment with his father where both of them express relief in seeing each other again, even if for the final time, before Destoroyah returns to get some payback for his initial defeat by the little one. This results in Junior being snatched up by Destoroyah and then dropped from a great height, leaving him on the brink of death. This moment would go on to spur Godzilla to furiously fighting Destoroyah to avenge his son's apparent death. However, as a result of his father's final moments, Junior is essentially reborn as a new Godzilla. The film ends with him standing where his father once stood, leaving the audience to question if Junior will be more destructive and hostile towards mankind like his father, or something better, a protector, given his history with mankind being more positive by comparison. So with Junior gone over and taken care of, let's discuss the matter regarding his father, Godzilla. Despite having been a more antagonistic version of the character throughout this series, certainly in comparison to the Showa version, who only starts to become more sympathetic by the time we get to Godzilla vs. Mechagodzilla 2, Godzilla goes through quite the ringer, both physically and emotionally, and his story culminates towards a tragic end. While he does attack cities like Hong Kong, Godzilla is shown to have a lot of excess energy which he blasts out of himself, and he's also acting out in pain, so it's very apparent that it's not as simple as him being malicious, but rather he's losing control of his own power, which is also killing him from the inside. And him being out and about again is due to him searching for his son after Boss Island was destroyed, as well as hoping to meet with him in the Bering Sea. Godzilla then finds a moment of respite and relief upon his reunion with Junior, thanks to Miki and Mero guiding them to one another, only for all that to be short-lived once Destoroyah, now in his final form, begins his strike. Believing his son to be dead, Godzilla sees this as him having lost the only member of his kind left, and that he was going to die the same way he started out at the beginning of the series, alone. This results in the Big G confronting and engaging in an intense final battle with Destoroyah, with the former eventually coming out of it victorious. However, this victory is a Pyrrhic one for the Big G as he finds himself reaching 1200 degrees Celsius, which is the point of him melting down. Thus he is bombarded by the JSDF in an effort to bring his temperature down as he dies. The final moments of Godzilla are treated with a strong sense of closure. Characters lamenting about how Godzilla coming to be in the first place was the result of humanity's abuse of atomic power. Lamenting how, despite everything he's done in the Heisei series, Godzilla was still a creature spawned by unfortunate and tragic circumstances that have all led up to him dying in a very painful way, both in a physical sense and with the knowledge that, as far as he knew, his son died before him. And yet, there is now solace knowing that Godzilla's suffering has finally ended, and that Miki's work, and by extension G-Force's work regarding Godzilla, is done. But as the day of one king ends, a new one begins with Junior, having been restored and mutated by his father's residual energy, now standing to continue the legacy, however it may look going forward. And this brings us to our primary antagonist, Destoroyah. My oh my, what a fitting villain he is for this particular end of an era. Destoroyah is the byproduct of events which transpired back in Godzilla 1954, an embodiment of the Oxygen Destroyer, the device which was used to kill the original Godzilla, and an emblem of the very horrors that its inventor feared would become a reality. Destoroyah starts out as a set of microorganisms that remained dormant since the Precambrian period, and had resided in the soil of where the original Godzilla died back in 1954, slowly mutating over the past 4 decades into a new, more deadly set of creatures thanks to the Oxygen Destroyer. This parallels Destoroyah's origin rather well with Godzilla's, where they both started out as prehistoric organisms that were changed and made into more monstrous beings as a result of mankind discovering and wielding power beyond its comprehension. However, as an unintended consequence by Fukuzawa's experiments with microoxygen, the Destoroyah is stirred up and they break out, steadily becoming bigger and more powerful over time. The Destoroyah then become one as a kaiju-sized monstrosity who then goes on to battle Junior first. Though beaten back temporarily, Destoroyah was able to puncture into the little one's chest, extracting some of his DNA while injecting some microoxygen into him in exchange. This action sets Destoroyah's final transformation into motion, where he's able to not only overpower and seemingly kill Junior and get some sadistic pleasure out of it, but also be able to combat against Godzilla. However, due to the Big G's burning state becoming increasingly more deadly, Destoroyah eventually takes more than enough of his share of abuse to where he tries to flee only for the JSDF to use their freezing tech to bring him down for good, ending his reign of terror. In terms of his design, it's simply just straight up iconic. While the final form does look a bit too thick on the thighs, especially for a creature that's meant to be aerodynamic, the various designs maintain a striking aesthetic consistent to how he's meant to be a mutated prehistoric crustacean. Then there's the devil-like aesthetics, such as his bat-like wings and the horns on his head, right down to how his final form rises from a fiery explosion, as if, from a Thematics standpoint, the sins of the Oxygen Destroyer's usage in 1954 have returned from hell to bring about humanity's doom, and so humanity has to recognize those sins and try to undo them, as represented by Fukuzawa, whose microoxygen experiments kick-started the rise of Destoroyah, collaborating with the UNGCC in stopping the threat before it could destroy all life on Earth. Needless to say, Destoroyah is one of my personal favorite kaiju in the Godzilla franchise, not just thanks to his awesome design, but also due to his significance in the Big G's legacy as a villain. So the kaiju side of the story is done justice overall, both in terms of its protagonist and its antagonist. And it certainly helps that their respective roles bolster the thematics well in a way that's equal parts congruent and compelling, especially as an emotional denouement for the King of the Monsters and his son. The action sequences in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah are quite spectacular for the most part. In fact, I'll even go as far as to say that it's some of the best in the entire franchise. From Godzilla's opening attack sequence in Hong Kong, which is complemented very nicely by Akira Ifukube's booming and ominous soundtrack, to Junior's battle with Destoroyah, to the climax where Godzilla does the same shortly after, the kaiju set pieces in the film are epic in every sense of the word. Junior's battle with Destoroyah showcases some tension in regards to whether or not the little G can hold his own, such as when Destoroyah physically overwhelms him and even injects his inner mouth into him, getting some of his DNA, which will facilitate Destoroyah's evolution into his final form, as well as showcasing Junior's tenacity during the fight and a display of his potential, which enable him to gain the upper hand. And then there's the climax, which closes the film on a pretty high note. From the tragedy of Godzilla witnessing his son being sadistically dropped to his death by Destoroyah, to the intensity of the Big G's explosive fury towards his foe, to the emotional crescendo of him finally meeting his end, the final battle showcases a good ebb and flow from start to finish. The sequence would have Godzilla and Destoroyah duking it out in brutal fashion, where the former partakes in an all-out assault with nothing left to lose, while the latter opts to be more tactical in his approach of defeating his foe, who is on the verge of melting down, such as splitting up into a swarm of smaller units and flying away when things get too hot and hairy, and evading after getting some good licks in. Then, in between rounds, there's time devoted to Godzilla mourning the loss of his son, and steadily melting down more and more, to the point where even his spines start melting away, which is a really neat and gnarly detail on the part of the suit design. The film is also quite striking on a visual level, such as with some shots involving Godzilla trudging through Hong Kong at night. There's some solid cinematography choices, especially during certain scenes, such as during the film's final moments, where we see the death of Godzilla and the rebirth of Junior. The haze of debris strikingly contrasts with an almost ethereal glow of Godzilla's body melting away while a cloud of radiation is expelled from him, which can be seen as being parallel to his soul. Then there's the dolly up to where we see Junior fully grown / evolved, now standing where his father once stood with a light blue glow casting him in silhouette, as if the spirit of Godzilla now lives on within him, symbolizing how the legacy of the Big G is eternal, not just in a meta sense, but also within the Heisei universe itself. There's also some rather neat effects work at play, such as when Godzilla steadily becomes frozen until his body is engulfed in ice during his bout against the Super X3. It's little effect shots like these that you can't help but appreciate how actually fairly well done they are, even with the film's limited budget. Now, with as much praise as I've given a lot of the kaiju-oriented set pieces, there is one set piece that I want to talk about which is of mixed quality, to say the least, and that's the set piece involving the swarm of Destoroyah attacking the Japanese police force and leading into Yukari trying to evade a lone Destoroyah. The first point worth noting is that the sequence where the police are suddenly ambushed by the Destoroyah bears quite the amount of similarities to a similar sequence in Aliens. And suffice to say, it is not a coincidence. From the setting being an industrial area with steel pipes and tight corridors that the police slowly navigate their way through in search of the cause of a recent disturbance, to some of the troops wielding miniguns with radar screens to indicate any incoming threats, to the way the Destoroyahs slinkily crawl through the pipes and eventually do a surprise attack on the troops. It is really hard to watch this scene and not think about the Colonial Marines and their first encounter with the Xenomorphs in Aliens. And it becomes really easy to see how Aliens did it better in every way. It's not to say that such similarities are enough on their own to tank this sequence in isolation. However, one can't help but think that Katsuge Mori, the screenwriter, or whoever was responsible for the scene, was taking a lot of cues from the first two Alien films, or heck, maybe even the third film as well, such as when the one Destoroyah sticks his inner mouth in Yukari while she's cornered, similarly to how a Xenomorph does the same to Ripley in Alien 3. While the sequence does find and showcasing how deadly the Destoroyah are when they overwhelm the troops in terms of numbers, power, and endurance, thus properly building up the tension of how much more powerful they'll become over time, the visual aesthetic along with the discipline and how to inject tension involving a swarm attacking trained militaristic professionals is still pretty hard to ignore when the comparisons to Aliens begin to arise. Heck, considering that Omori used key plot elements from the Terminator films back when he did Godzilla vs. King Ghidorah, it begs the question of whether or not the powers that be at Toho are a bunch of hypocrites for being so gung-ho about people using their copyrighted material, yet a writer for some of their films copied from some of James Cameron's most iconic works to the point where it's amazing that they didn't get sued for plagiarism. And speaking of an inner mouth, yeah, Destoroyah, or at least his more human-sized form and aggregate form, has an inner mouth that's akin to what the xenomorphs have, intended to pierce into their prey to either kill or wound them. Just in case I haven't made the point clear enough that there are quite the amount of cues that Godzilla vs. Destoroyah takes from the Alien franchise to the point where it can easily be distracting. The inner mouth does come back later when Destoroyah uses it on Junior, so one could say that the Destoroyah attacking Yukari was also trying to do the same to her by injecting micro-oxygen into her system. However, the presentation is still very blatant in terms of what this scene is mimicking. But we're not done yet with this moment. If the Destoroyah is so hell-bent on killing Yukari to where he's actively tearing up the car that she's in just to get to her, why doesn't he just kill her with his beam attack, like he did to certain other characters before, instead of trying to get up close and personal, which would take up valuable time and compromise his survival? Oh, right, because we have to have the visual of the Destoroyah trying to get Yukari in with his inner mouth for the sake of tension and for the alien influence. Okay, cool, got it. Unfortunately, because the Destoroyah's efficiency as a scary monster was compromised thanks to what the script wanted it to do, the tension of whether or not Yukari would make it out alive is also compromised. I can understand why the Destoroyah would use the inner mouth on Junior, and that's to get some of his G-cells in order to become more powerful, along with injecting him with micro-oxygen. But what exactly would this Destoroyah gain from trying to do the same thing with Yukari? It's not like she's a mutant herself or anything. Not to mention, there's even some sloppy direction when the Destoroyah is able to sneak up on Yukari in the car. Well, that's a tongue twister. Yukari in the car. Anyway, okay, let me get back on track. There's some sloppy direction when he's trying to sneak up on her in the car, despite the fact that the creature is out in the open and is clearly visible. How Yukari wouldn't be able to track its movements, despite how unsubtle they are, and her best interest being in her own self-preservation, is beyond me. Not to mention the fact that this creature, despite being a Chungus crab monster roaming around out in the open, could just sneak up on Yukari in any way is just silly. He's big, red and orange, and has a lot of legs that collectively make noise with each step. Hey, he's making noise himself through his vocals. So how is he able to sneak up on her without her seeing him first? While the creature design for the Destoroyah is well done, and there's some neat animatronics going for them, such as with how the eyes blink on occasion to give the animatronics more of a lifelike quality, some of the Destoroyah's movements, such as with how one charges into a squad of troops, appears pretty stiff. And there's even a moment where one Destoroyah smashes its way down a ceiling, and it actually bounces on the ground once it lands, as if it's just a lightweight prop and not a big, beefy, heavy crustacean monster like it's supposed to be. So, to close this bit of discussion out, this ain't no Aliens. No, that's it. That's all I gotta say about that. This ain't no Aliens. Anyways, moving right along. Now, for as much praise as I've given to certain aspects of the film's visual work earlier in this video, there are still some floopy and even downright awkward effects work here and there, even excluding some that are in the police force / Destoroyah sequence. While the Kaiju suitmation is still quite solid, some aspects of it are still a bit awkward, like in regards to some of Destoroyah's puppetry. For example, in his flying form, he appears to be somewhat stiff-looking. Sure, he's moving his head and mouth around, but there is a certain stiffness going on in terms of how he's flying, in that he looks more like a jet than a living creature, and it's kind of hard to see how it could be in any way intentional. And there are times where his aggregate form moves in ways that just don't really look all that right. Like when he appears to be floating up off of the building that's collapsing onto Junior, despite the fact that he's not in his flying form at all. If it's meant to be him simulated jumping, then it still looks pretty stiff because his legs don't really seem to be moving in a way that look as if he's jumping. It's much less noticeable because it comes and goes rather quickly, but if you catch it, it's hard to unsee it. There's also a couple moments during the last third of the movie where Junior himself looks very stiff, and it's so very clearly a motorized miniature to the point where his legs aren't moving. And it looks as if Junior is hovering away when Godzilla is suddenly attacked by Destoroyah. I get that there wasn't a lot of options to present Junior sharing the screen as Godzilla, because aside from possibly an infant, there's no known person who could do summation at that scale. But surely they could have at least motorized the Junior miniature's legs to simulate a walking motion. Well, actually, scratch that. The miniature's legs can visibly move, but the movement itself still looks robot-like and artificial. Ergo, it's still not a very convincing effect. It'd be one thing if this was still back in the Showa era, where the limitations of technology would make this sort of thing excusable, but this is less excusable for an entry in the Heisei era, 30 plus years later, to have this thing be the case, considering that we were meant to see more of an advancement in what special effects and tokusatsu are capable of. But the most awkward of the effects flumps are in regards to how certain environments look with the monster action superimposed in the background. There are a couple shots of Godzilla's rampage in Hong Kong where people appear to be just casually strolling in the city streets despite the fact that there's a kaiju attack happening. And there's one shot during the climax where there are people walking in the airport's terminal despite there being a kaiju battle taking place not too far off in the distance. Realistically speaking, not only would all flights be cancelled in the event of a kaiju attack, but also the airport would not have that many people left in there by this point, because there would have been plenty of time for it to be fully evacuated before Godzilla and Junior finally arrived. Now, to wrap this segment up so that we can move right along into the conclusion, the film does still have a lot of merits when it comes to its spectacle and some of its technical fidelity, especially when it comes to its kaiju battles, while at the same time it has some flumps in its effects work during certain points. And it even has one set piece that wears its similarities to other films on its sleeves with bright neon bulbs, while bringing an awkward amount of attention to how much better those other films did what it was trying to do. Suffice it to say, it's a bit mixed. Leaning more towards positive than negative, that's for sure. And even some of the technical flukes in this film that I've mentioned aren't even close to being the worst that we've seen in the Heisei era, or even in any Godzilla film in general. But room for improvement does still apply in this case. And so, that just about covers all that needs to be covered in Godzilla vs. Destoroyah, which means it is now time for us to bring this essay video on it to a close in a similar way that the film itself did the same for the Big G's Heisei era. Godzilla vs. Destoroyah still holds up well as the conclusion to the Big G's Heisei saga. It certainly has flumpy bits and bobs, but not enough to where the whole picture ends up being bad at the end of the day. It boasts strong thematics which are bolstered pretty well by the story and some damn good kaiju sequences. The writing certainly could have been tighter in certain parts, or at least could have used more flesh in its metaphorical bones, but the plot and character writing are both functional for the most part. So even with the issues in mind, Godzilla vs. Destoroyah comes together pretty well in terms of filmmaking, and it stands as a satisfying end of an era for the King of the Monsters himself. And if any media post-1995 are anything to go by, it's that it should be safe to say that this film has quite the legacy for itself that won't be showing any signs of wane anytime soon. And so that just about does it here for this essay video of mine on Godzilla vs. Destoroyah. I would like to thank you all very much for watching. If this video fancied you, I recommend checking out some of my past content if you haven't already, and following me on here for more that is to come. Whether it be an essay video that is in the works or a live stream being hosted by yours truly or whatever it may be, I'll be sure to signpost any updates in regards to future content down the line. But until then, once again, thanks for watching, and I will see you all later. Long live the King.